It's the 16th of March, 1914, in Brooklyn, New York. On a slipway at the government's own shipyard, the New York Navy Yard, the first steel of a new battleship is being lowered onto the keel blocks. Among the officials gathered to watch it go down stands a young man, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His name is Franklin Roosevelt. He is watching the birth of the USS Arizona. He doesn't know that 27 years later he'll stand before Congress as President of the United States and ask for a declaration of war because the ship whose keel he watched laid this morning is burning at the bottom of Pearl Harbor with over 1,000 of her men still inside her. Everyone remembers those last 9 minutes. Almost no one remembers these first 31 months. This is the story of the machines that built the USS Arizona. She was a $16 million super-dreadnought, and she was built at a government yard in Brooklyn out of 3 gambles the United States had never made all at once before. She would burn only oil, never coal, at a time when almost every warship afloat still ran on coal. She would carry her main guns 3 to a turret, in a mounting so new it was barely off the drawing board, and she would wear her armor by a rule no American battleship had yet followed. Everything piled onto the vital spaces, and nothing wasted on the rest. Each choice was a risk on its own, welded and riveted into one hull at one yard by the men who worked it. Together they made her the most modern thing the country had ever sent to sea. The wreck at Pearl Harbor became a shrine. The slipway in Brooklyn where she began slipped out of memory. So we are going to start where she started, down on the blocks, and build her back up the way they did, one machine at a time. The New York Navy Yard stood on the Brooklyn waterfront at a bend of the East River, and it didn't belong to a company. It belonged to the government. Most of the great warships of that age came out of private firms. The yards at Newport News, the Fore River Works up in Massachusetts, contractors who bid for the work and took their profit out of the steel. Arizona was different. She was ordered into the Navy's own yard, laid down by men on the government's own payroll, on ground that had been turning out American warships since before the Civil War. The country had decided to build its most modern battleship with its own hands. On the 16th of March, 1914, they laid her keel. The first plates of steel came down onto the keel blocks running the length of the slipway, and from that spine the hull began to grow frame by frame, rib by rib, toward the shape of a ship. And she was vast. Arizona was a super-dreadnought, 608 feet from stem to stern, 97 feet across the beam, displacing 29,158 long tons as she stood and close to 32,000 with all her fuel and stores aboard, over 4,000 tons heavier and 25 feet longer than the Nevada-class ships she had been drawn from. Everything about her was a size up on what had come before. The finished ship would cost the country around $16 million, and to understand what that figure meant, the bare hull of her sister Pennsylvania was contracted at $7.8 million before a single gun or a single plate of armor was added on top. She was among the most expensive things the United States had ever set out to build, and the Navy wanted her fast. Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, was pushing his yards to set records to prove that America could put a capital ship in the water as quickly as any power on Earth. The plan for Arizona was a sprint, keel to launch in something like 10 months. It didn't happen. The work took 15. Her sister ship Pennsylvania, driven even harder, was meant to beat the standing American record by 2 months, and instead of the 14 months her schedule called for, she took 17 to reach the water. The ambition ran out ahead of the steel. A hull this large and this new could only be hurried so far before the hurrying stopped mattering, because a battleship in 1914 was still built in the end by hand. The steam cranes lifted the plates and the heavy frames into place, but it was men who set them. Men out on wooden staging lashed up the flanks of the rising hull, men down inside the double bottom working in the dark, men swarming over a steel wall that climbed higher out of the slip every week. And it was riveting that held her together. Hundreds of thousands of rivets, heated red and portable forges right there on the staging, thrown glowing to a catcher, hammered home while they were still soft by gangs working in a rhythm you could hear clear across the yard. It was loud, dangerous, exhausting work, done in the heat coming off the river in summer and the cold coming off it in winter, high up with a long way to fall. These were the men who actually built her, and history would remember almost none of them. Through 1914 and on into 1915, the hull climbed. The bottom went in first, then the sides, then the barbettes, the great armored wells that would one day carry her guns, rising like round towers out of the deck. From the yard floor, she stopped looking like a frame and started looking like a ship. But an empty hull could do nothing on its own. It was only a container, a shape waiting to be filled. Everything that would make Arizona modern, everything that justified the $16 million and the risk the Navy was taking on her was still to come, still to be lowered down inside those steel walls and bolted to her frames. And the very first of those gambles was not her guns, and it was not her armor. It was the decision made before any of it about what she would burn to move. And the decision was oil. Arizona was built to burn oil and only oil. No coal at all. She was among the very first battleships in the United States Navy designed that way from the keel up, and in 1914 that was a genuinely risky choice, close to a reckless one. For generations, the world's warships had run on coal. A battleship of the old kind carried coal by the thousands of tons, packed into bunkers along her sides, and it took an army of men to move it. Deep in the ship, below the waterline, the stokers worked the furnaces by hand, shoveling coal into the fireboxes hour after hour in a heat that could break a man. They were the black gangs, the men who kept the ship alive and were never once seen from the deck. And coaling the ship, filling those bunkers before she sailed, was its own ordeal. The whole crew turned out filthy and exhausted, hauling coal aboard sack by sack for a day or more at a time. Coal was slow to load. It choked the ship's own spaces with men and dust and heat, and it tied a warship to the ports and the colliers that could supply it. But it was what every Navy on Earth knew, and navies don't give up what they know without a hard reason. The reason was arithmetic. The Navy's own bureau had put a number on it. Pound for pound, oil produced 55% more steam than coal, more than half, again, as much power out of every pound of fuel a ship had to carry. That single figure changed everything downstream of it. It meant a ship could steam farther on the same weight of fuel, or carry far less fuel for the same distance and spend the weight she saved somewhere else. It meant she could be refueled at sea from a tanker running alongside instead of sending exhausted men down into the bunkers with shovels. And it meant the stokers, the black gangs, the whole shoveling apparatus of the coal age could simply go away. So they built her to drink oil. 12 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers were lowered down into her, oil-fired, seated in her boiler rooms deep below the armored deck. Fuel oil sprayed into the fireboxes as a fine mist and burned there in a steady, controlled roar, and the water threading through the boiler tubes flashed instantly to steam. That steam was the entire purpose of the ship's lower half. Feed the 12 boilers, make the steam, and everything else the hull could do began in those rooms. The steam ran aft to 4 sets of Parsons turbines coupled to her 4 propeller shafts. These were bladed wheels spun by steam, driving the shafts directly, in place of the reciprocating engines and their great nodding pistons that had driven warships for half a century. Together, the 4 of them put out 34,000 shaft horsepower, and 34,000 horsepower drove close to 30,000 tons of battleship through the water at 21 knots. For a hull her size in her day, that was genuinely fast. But the weight mattered more than the speed. Every ton of fuel a ship doesn't have to carry is a ton she's free to spend on something else. Oil gave more steam per pound, so Arizona could do the same work with less fuel dead weight, and her oil-fired plant took up less of her than a coal plant of the same power would have demanded. All through her design, that saved weight was sitting there waiting to be used. And a warship spends saved weight in exactly 2 places. She spends it on the guns she carries, and she spends it on the armor that keeps her alive long enough to fire them. That was the quiet logic running underneath the whole ship. The decision about what she burned, made before a single gun was mounted or a single plate of armor was hung, was the decision that made room for the guns and the armor at all. The oil she burned freed the weight that the guns and the armor above it were built from. And what it paid for first were her guns. Up above the boiler rooms and the turning shafts, up in the daylight where all that saved weight had gone, Arizona was built to carry a main battery unlike almost anything then afloat. 12 heavy guns. What made her new and dangerous was less the number of guns than the way the Navy had chosen to mount them, in a design so new it had barely been tried before her keel was laid. The main battery was 12 guns, each one a 14-inch rifle that could throw a shell farther than a man on her deck could see. 12 heavy guns was a great many for a ship of her day. But navies had put a dozen big guns to sea before, so the count by itself did not set Arizona apart. What made her new was that those 12 guns rode in only 4 turrets. For years the pattern had held, 2 guns to a turret and a turret for every pair. Put 10 or 12 heavy guns aboard a ship that way and you needed 5 or 6 turrets, strung out along the deck fore and aft, each one a separate armored tower with its own machinery beneath it and its own thick ring of steel wrapped around its base. And each turret was only the visible top of a structure that ran deep into the ship, down through an armored trunk to the shell rooms and the powder magazines far below the waterline. Every turret you added was more weight, more length of hull that had to be protected, more of the ship given over to carrying guns instead of surviving with them. There was a ceiling to how many heavy guns you could mount before the arithmetic of steel and weight simply stopped you. The answer was to put more guns in each turret, 3 instead of 2. The triple turret was close to brand new and it was American. The Navy hadn't even authorized its first one until 1911, only a few years before Arizona's own turrets were built and lowered onto her. When her guns were mounted, the whole concept had barely been proven at sea. She was among the first ships in the world to carry it in numbers. 4 turrets, 3 guns apiece, and the payoff was exactly the weight the entire design had been chasing from the keel up. 12 guns and 4 turrets instead of 6. 2 fewer armored towers, 2 fewer trunks to wrap in Krupp steel, a shorter stretch of the ship that had to be armored at all. The oil in the bottom of the hull had bought the guns. The triple turret gave some of that weight back, carrying the same guns and fewer lighter mountings. But cramming 3 heavy rifles into one turret created a problem no 2-gun turret had ever faced. When all 3 fired at once, the 3 shells left the muzzles side by side, only a few feet apart, tearing through the same torn and shaking air in the same instant. And they interfered with one another. The pressure wave riding along each shell in flight pushed against the shells beside it, nudging them off their line so that a turret firing all 3 barrels together threw its shots wider than it should have. The middle gun sat worst of all, hemmed in on both sides at once. The fix was almost absurdly simple. The Navy delayed the center gun. When the turret fired, the 2 outer barrels spoke first, and the middle barrel followed a fraction of a second behind them, its shell leaving only after its neighbors had cleared the way and the air between them had begun to settle. The delay was far too short for any man watching to catch. It was a sliver of a second built into the firing gear itself, and it pulled the 3 shells back into a tight pattern miles down range. 3 guns in one turret fired a fraction apart so they struck as one. The 12 big guns were the reason she existed, but they weren't her only teeth. Ranged along her hull, she also carried a battery of smaller, faster-firing guns meant for a different enemy entirely. Their target was the small, quick torpedo craft that could dart in close where the great rifles were too slow and too heavy to follow. Her heavy guns were built to kill things miles away. The lighter guns were there to stop those fast, close attackers before they ever got near enough to matter. So Arizona would carry more heavy guns and fewer turrets than almost anything then afloat, and every one of them was a machine built to deal out ruin at a distance. But a ship made to hand out violence on that scale had to be made to take it in return. Guns decided what Arizona could do to another ship, what she could live through when the shells came back the other way, came down entirely to her armor. And the way the Navy chose to armor her broke with every battleship that had ever gone before her. For as long as there had been armored ships, the men who built them had spread the steel thin and wide. A thick belt low along the waterline, a thinner band above it, thinner plating again toward the bow and the stern, tapering off as it went. Every part of the ship got something. The idea was to protect the whole hull, at least a little, everywhere. It was the way warships had been armored for a generation, and on the day Arizona's keel went down, it was still the accepted wisdom of every Navy on Earth. Arizona was among the first ships in the world built to throw that wisdom away. The problem with spreading the armor around was that the guns had gotten too good. By 1914, a battleship fought at ranges of miles, and at those ranges, shells no longer came in flat and low. They arched up and fell, plunging down out of the sky onto the decks and the upper works, and they hit with a violence that thin plating couldn't even slow. A band of medium armor that might have turned a shell in the close battles of an earlier age was, against a modern 14-inch gun, worse than nothing. It added weight. It added the false comfort of protection. And it stopped no shell that mattered. You were carrying steel that couldn't do the one thing steel on a warship was for. So the men who designed Arizona made a hard and simple choice. They divided the ship into 2 kinds of place. There were the parts she couldn't survive without, and there was everything else. The magazines that held her powder, the turrets and the trunks that ran down to them, the boilers and the turbines that drove her, the conning tower where she would be fought. Those were the vital organs gathered into one long armored box in the center of the hull. Everything in that box got the heaviest armor the ship could carry. Everything outside it got none at all. They called it all or nothing. The vital box was armored as heavily as she could manage, and the ends of the ship were left bare. It sounds reckless to leave the ends of a battleship unarmored on purpose. In practice, it was the most deliberate calculation on the whole ship. The reasoning went that a shell passing through an unarmored bow or stern would punch clean through and out the other side, or burst in empty space where there was nothing vital to wreck. Let it. Better to hand the enemy the parts of the ship that didn't matter and pour every ton of saved steel into the parts that did. The box in the middle would hold, or the ship was lost anyway. No other outcome was worth spending armor to guard against, and this was where all of it came together. The oil in the bottom of the hull had freed weight from the fuel. The triple turrets had freed weight from the guns. All of that saved tonnage had to go somewhere, and now it had a home. It went into the armor. The weight the machinery gave back was poured straight into the box around the machinery, thickening the belt and the turret faces to numbers no earlier American battleship had carried. The three gambles were never really three separate things. They were one bargain. The weight saved by the oil and the guns went into the armor, and protecting that armored box was the entire purpose of the ship. The figures were brutal. The main belt along her side was Krupp armor 13.5 inches thick, a wall of hardened steel standing between her vitals and the sea. The faces of her turrets, the flat forward plates that would take a shell head-on, were 18 inches. The conning tower, the armored citadel where her officers would stand and fight her, was wrapped in 16 inches of steel. These were not numbers spread thin across a whole ship. They were concentrated deliberately onto the one box that decided whether she lived, and everything else on the hull was left to fend for itself so that box could be made as strong as it was. That was the design. Oil below, 12 guns and 4 turrets above, and around the heart of her the thickest armor a battleship had yet worn, all of it arranged by a doctrine that was itself only a few years old. On paper, she was already one of the most advanced fighting machines afloat, and she had never touched water. Because for all of it, everything built into her so far had happened with the ship sitting still. She was a hull on a set of blocks in a Brooklyn yard, held up out of the water by timber and steel, going nowhere. All the boilers and the turbines and the guns and the armor in the world meant nothing until the day she came off those blocks and the sea took her weight for the first time. And that day when it came would draw a crowd of tens of thousands and would turn on the strangest christening in the history of the United States Navy. On the 19th of June, 1915, the timber and the blocks that had held Arizona up for 15 months came away, and for the first time the ship moved. She went down the greased ways of the Brooklyn Navy Yard stern first, a bare gray hull with no guns and no boilers yet inside her, gathering speed until the East River took her weight and she floated free, a warship for the first time in the only sense that mattered on that day. Tens of thousands of people had come to watch it, packing the waterfront and the piers to see the newest capital ship in the American fleet meet the water. By long tradition, a ship is christened at the moment she goes, a bottle broken across her bow as she takes the sea. That honor fell to a sponsor, and Arizona's sponsor was a 17-year-old girl from Prescott named Esther Ross, a pharmacist's daughter chosen for the ship by the governor of the state whose name she would carry. It should have been the simplest part of the whole day. Instead, it had become the strangest christening the Navy had ever staged, and the reason was the bottle itself. Only that same month, the state of Arizona had voted itself dry. Prohibition had come to the desert by the will of its own people, and a great many of them didn't want the ship that bore their name blessed with a bottle of champagne. To break wine across her bow, they felt, was to launch her on the very thing they had just outlawed. But the Navy held beliefs of its own, older and more stubborn than any temperance vote. To christen a warship with plain water, the old hands warned, was to curse her before she ever sailed. It was a bad omen. No sailor wanted to send a ship to sea under one, so they used 2 bottles. The compromise pleased everyone and no one. One bottle held champagne, the tradition the Navy would not surrender. The other held water, and not ordinary water. It was the first water ever to pass over the spillway of the newly completed Roosevelt Dam out in the Arizona desert, carried all the way across the country in glass so the ship could be christened with something her home state had made. The sponsor swung both bottles against the bow as the hull went down. The state got the water it had wanted, and the Navy kept the wine its traditions demanded. And Arizona took the sea christened twice over, once for the desert that had named her, and once for the fleet she was about to join. But a launching was a long way from a finished ship. The hull that slid into the East River that June was little more than a shell, and the hardest year of her building still lay in front of her. She was towed to a fitting-out pier, and for the next 16 months the yard put into her everything the launch had left out. The 12 oil-fired boilers were lowered down into her hull. The turbines were seated on their beds and coupled to the shafts. The 4 triple turrets were set into their barbettes, and the 14-inch guns run out through the ports. The armor belt was hung along her sides, plate by 13.5-inch plate, until the box in the middle of her was finally closed. Month by month, the bare gray shape of the launch filled in and became a fighting ship. On the 17th of October, 1916, the work was done, and the United States Navy took delivery of her. Arizona was commissioned into the fleet, a completed super-dreadnought at last, every gamble built into her and every ton of armor hung in place. 2 years and 7 months had passed since her keel first went down onto the blocks in Brooklyn. Everything her designers had promised was now steel and oil and hardened plate, riveted into one hull and floating at a New York pier. All that remained was to take her out and find out whether any of it worked. A ship can look perfect on paper and still fail the moment she meets open water. The boilers had never been fired in anger, the turbines had never turned a screw against open water, and the guns had never been laid on a target that moved. Her first cruise would test every promise at once, 4 years of work, and every new idea in the American fleet answered in a single voyage. That voyage was waiting for her in the cold end of that year, and it wouldn't go the way a single man at the yard expected. She stood out of New York on the 7th of December 1916 to run her trials and find out whether 4 years of work had produced a warship or an expensive mistake. She got her answer fast, and it wasn't the one the yard wanted. Somewhere out on that first cruise, one of her Parsons turbines stripped its blading and failed. The same delicate machinery that oil and speed had been built around wrecked before she had steamed a proper distance under her own power. There was no clean way to reach it. To pull the damaged turbine out of her, yard workers had to cut holes down through the upper decks they had just finished plating, open the ship they had spent 2.5 years closing, and lift the ruined machine out through the wound. The repairs took the better part of 4 months before she could take the sea again as a working ship of the line. Keep the date. She left on the 7th of December, and 25 years later, to the very day, she would be lying broken at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Nobody standing on her deck that cold morning in 1916 could have read the coincidence, and there's no reason it should mean anything. It only sits there in the record, an accident of the calendar waiting. Somewhere behind all of it were the men. The riveters who closed her hull by hand, the yard hands who hung 13.5-inch plate along her sides, and seated turrets that weighed as much as a small ship. The workers who later cut into their own finished decks to save her turbine. The Brooklyn yard didn't keep the kind of record that would let anyone say how many of them were hurt or killed bringing her into being, and no honest account will invent one. What can be said is that a hull that size was built by hand at height over water with the heaviest iron the age could forge, and that the men who did it are the least remembered part of the whole story. The rest is the part everyone knows. The oil-fired super-dreadnought born in Brooklyn became the most famous wreck in America, and the young Assistant Secretary of the Navy who had watched her first steel go down onto the block stood before Congress, an old and tired president now, and asked for a declaration of war over the ship he had seen begin.